I'm introducing my new book, Spoiling Tibet, China and Resource Nationalism on the Roof of the World, a title that hopefully manages to convey something. Tibet is full of minerals. Maybe that's not surprising given that the Tibetan Plateau, contrary to a lot of people's supposition, is actually a huge area, same as Western Europe, and being geologically new, still uplifting, it's full of minerals, and those minerals are often very close to the surface. In fact, European historians, the Greeks and the Romans, knew that Tibet was rich in minerals, over 2,000 years ago. So maybe it's not surprising that Chinese geologists have assiduously combed Tibet to prove exactly what is where and how to extract it, and now that extraction is starting to happen on a huge scale. Up until now there hasn't been a book about the resource extraction economy of Tibet and how Tibet feeds the world's factory, that insatiable, resource-hungry machine that is moving closer and closer to Tibet as Chinese industry in the search of freedom from environmental regulation costs and lower labour costs moves closer to the sources of supply, which are in Tibet. And as a result, world-scale mining in Tibet is really just starting to happen, and it's about to transform Tibet. Despite that, this is the only book about mining in Tibet, and it may not be quite as dry as a title on mining in Tibet might suggest. It actually starts off with trying to look at the Tibetan Plateau, and particularly the mountain slopes where the minerals are found, often directly above the major rivers of Asia, through Tibetan eyes, to enable you as a reader, if you care to follow the link below to the publisher and to the book, to see that landscape, see the sacred mountains, the lakes of the goddesses below, the pilgrimage circuits, the meaningfulness inscribed into that landscape by devoted Tibetan Buddhists over thousands of years who used those landscapes as a means of purifying the mind. And to see that as an alternative and quite legitimate use of landscape compared to the readily quantifiable monetary gain of exploiting Tibet, extracting those resources and shipping off the gold, the silver, the molybdenum, and above all the copper, and as well as the lithium for the lithium-ion batteries in the computer or tablet or phone on which you might be looking at me right now, which may well have been sourced from Tibet. So one of the bottom lines of this book, and there are some independent reviews of it available by following the link below, one of the conclusions of this book is that China probably could get by without accessing the resources of Tibet, but of course Tibet is close. Tibet promises in the long run to be cheap, to be a place of captive mines, where the mine serves the needs of distant Chinese metal manufacturers and smelters, and the end of this long and complex supply chain, commodity chain story is that the lithium-ion battery in your mobile device, increasingly, if it's made in China, and especially in Western China, which is much more common these days, comes from Tibet. So your life is now directly connected to Tibet in a way that was never true before. So all of these things come together. But at the heart of it, there's this paradox. There are these two ways of looking at the landscape: as a potential industrial landscape in which the exploitation of minerals is the first step towards becoming a modern economy, and Tibet becoming part of the global economy and taking the long, slow, arduous, dirty and disruptive path of eventually becoming a materially rich society, or the alternative Tibetan understanding of those same landscapes as having extraordinary value, perhaps even exceptional value, as the landscapes in which the great saints, the great meditators, the great crazy yogis, the wisdom lineages of the most famous lamas of Tibet actually went into those landscapes of solitude, as I call them in the book, to transform their minds. Now, we live in times where a monetary value can and is put on alternative uses of land or rivers or other natural resources, but is there some way of comparing and valuing those landscapes of solitude for the transformation of the mind, the journey within, that does require solitude, it does require living beyond human habitation, and Tibet has traditionally abounded in such wonderful places. Is there some way of making that comparison? That's one of the paradoxes that I would like to present to you as the reader, and I'd love your feedback. I'd really like to hear from you about how we juggle those. If you manage to look at the first chapter as the scene setter before plunging into the economics of mining, where does the equation lie? What's the bottom line? You tell me.